Welcome, everybody, to C to CEO on Air. Today's podcast, I'm so excited about. Our guest is Dr. Rick Garlick, and I'll tell you a little bit about him in a minute, but we're going to talk everything CSR, corporate social responsibility. I want to do a quick notation about what we're doing at C to CEO. And Cinderella to CEO has been a brand that's been around for about 15 years when I wrote a book called From Cinderella to CEO. So taking that transformation and moving the concept of transformation in your career to everything from uh, curriculum, community, and coaching, we've launched a new website and it's cinderellaceo.com. So if you haven't gone to the new website, I want you to check it out and give me your opinion on what you like or maybe don't like about it. And because we're constantly making improvements, and I want you to do that for me if you would please. We have a great course coming up being taught by one of my colleagues, Dr. Faye Hall Jackson from Tuskegee University. She and I will be teaching a course that begins June 10th. Go to cinderellaceo.com/curriculum and find out all about that course. And I really want you to enroll in it. It is fantastic. It has there's a relation to what we're going to be talking about today, diversity and inclusion in the 2021 workforce. You can message me on Facebook at Cinderella CEO, go to LinkedIn, or go to, I'm giving you lots of URLs, but cinderellaceo.com/discovery. So you have no excuse not to contact me about this. And I really want to talk to you and get your opinion. So with that, the advertisement's over for now, but the clock is ticking. I just want you to know. And I'll show you this cute little slide I have in a minute about the actual way the clock is ticking. But with that, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to one of the experts in corporate social responsibility who you may know from positions he's held with J.D. Power and Associates, the Gallup Organization, Maritz CX. He's helped Fortune 1000 companies with their strategic initiatives around branding, customer experience, and employee experience. And Dr. Rick Garlick is a strategy consultant with Magid, a consumer insights company. And Rick is based in Pennsylvania, but he talks to people all over the world all the time. And he and I have had a long-term relationship in the hospitality industry. I've accessed his research. We've attended seminars and trips together that we have learned from Rick in ways that have really shaped lots of people's careers. So I'm excited to have him on the podcast today. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you so much, Cary. That was a wonderful introduction. I think you got my life story captured in about 3 minutes.
Oh, I don't know. There's more where that came from, I know. So tell us more about you, Rick, and tell us what we need to know today.
Well, I started off my career as a professor, and when you're a professor, you never really leave the classroom. And instead of teaching 18 to 22-year-old undergrads, my students today are the people with whom I work. And I love learning and I love sharing knowledge. And I think we're in a very exciting time in history because it's pivotal. Everything has changed in the last year at an unprecedented level.
Amen to that.
It's really an exciting time to be alive because there's so much opportunity. And I know some of the folks on this podcast who are listening in are really on the cutting edge of that new opportunity. So I'm anxious to jump in and talk about our topic today of corporate social responsibility, or in some circles, it's known as ESG, environmental, social, and governmental. We also have a big umbrella that sustainability initiatives are part of, and we'll talk about all that.
Cool. And, I think I'm so glad you brought up ESG, environmental, social
governance,
because I have been reading, since we've been talking a lot more about how That's a very important part, especially for the new workforce, or the current workforce, depending on how you look at it. Right now, everybody's having issues with regard to finding employees, right? It's like
Mhm.
it is a problem I don't think anybody ever thought we'd ever have. But you give a history about how and why corporate social responsibility is more important than ever to employees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think really we have to take everything we're experiencing now from a historical context. If you look at the beginning of the 20th century, we were in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, and there was a lot of wealth disparity between those who owned the factories, what Marx called the means of production, and the working class, the working force. And if you look at the 1920s and 30s, there was something called the Big Red Scare, which is very comparable to what people are experiencing in some circles today, where interest in communism and socialism was rising quite a bit because they recognized that there was this big disparity between the people that owned the capital and the people that were the workforce.
Yeah,
And
it kind of
so,
sounds like today.
well, yeah, yeah. In
Yeah.
fact, but there was a significant difference in that basically we were a manufacturing driven economy at the time. And so
Hmm.
the physical plant, if you work for me, I can get rid of you and I can find somebody else to come in and push that button or put that bar on the line. So what happened was at the time, the labor movement came and basically reduced that gap between the haves and the have-nots. So someone like my father, who was an auto worker beginning in 1950, had an eighth grade education, was able to provide a nice middle class lifestyle for my mother and myself. And also, there were emerging social programs that provided a safety net for those people that were truly on hard times. And because of the efforts of people like Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower, we got along pretty well as a pretty prosperous society under the general capitalist system. Well, over the years, what's happened is, as we all know, we all read about this, that disparity between those who have and those who have not has grown significantly. And
Yes.
now I think it's probably at the biggest point that it's ever been at.
Wow.
And that's why we see a lot of people flirting with this idea of bringing a more socialist approach to our country.
Hmm.
College students are getting out of college right now and huge student loans and are finding it difficult to get a job. We know about things like the gender gap. We know that there's social injustice issues that have been really brought to our attention in the last year. And so what's happening is that business, and by business, I mean the broad corporate environment, is
Mhm.
taking note and saying that what we've got now, the capitalist system we've got now, is unsustainable in its present form, because ultimately you have to have wealth in order to buy the products and keep everything going, and you've got to have a planet that's sustainable, and you've got to
Mhm.
have as we're becoming more diverse as a country,
Yeah.
you've got to have a workforce that looks more like America. And all of these things have become, as the title of the session is, the social imperative, the new imperative, because these things are not just nice to have, or suddenly corporate America has gotten a conscience and they want to start doing the right thing by people. It's necessary for them to be successful in business. And as we're getting more and more public scrutiny and pressure, and particularly when you've got an administration very concerned about these issues, it becomes a matter of, if you don't take care of these issues yourself, the government or social forces are going to step in and require that you do these things.
Hmm.
So would you rather control your destiny, and would you rather use it as part of your strategic branding initiative, or would you rather let someone externally force that destiny? Would you rather use it to enhance your brand messaging, or basically you're at the mercy of a web crawling application that will define your brand for you based on what you do or do not do? So that's why this is the new imperative for corporate America today, not because it's nice and good and humane, but because it's necessary for business to be successful.
Oh my gosh, this is a great perspective and hearing this. And, a lot of people who listen to our podcast on Spreaker and iTunes and Spotify, Rick, they're looking for career advice in many cases. So, as we go through some of the things, the questions, and some of the slides, if you could keep in mind, maybe how someone and your information will help them, but how they might either apply for a position in corporate social responsibility or prepare themselves to be able to run a department or join a staff or a team. What you might think of in terms of skill sets they need.
Well, let me just give you one right off the top of the podcast and say that if you really want to be successful in this role,
Yeah.
you have to approach your job from a strategic rather than reactive perspective. Now, what do I mean by that? So much of what I see on websites and news releases is all reactive. So something happened in the news and my company has to take a position on it, or my company has to make a statement on it.
Mhm.
And it's all sort of reacting after the fact. That essentially you want to be good at this job, then think about this, apply some of the things we're about to talk about. Think of it as a strategic initiative rather than a reactive initiative.
Mhm.
So when we talk about strategic, how does your corporate social responsibility and sustainability programs, how do they fit into your brand identity? How do they link to who your employees are, their values, your customers' values, and the values of important stakeholders that we'll talk about in just a bit?
I love it. I love it. So it sounds like people that have a strong background in marketing have a good will have a good perspective on
Mhm.
this and be excited about it because it will gain customers. So that's what you're
Mhm.
going to talk about is
Absolutely.
all the stakeholders. So let me share my screen if I haven't already. So we're going to go through a few slides. While I'm doing that, because we see a grandfather clock in your background,
Hmm.
can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm going to divert while you're
Sure.
okay. Tell us about your clock.
Sure. For people who are watching the podcast and not just listening to it, the grandfather clock in the background was my mother's. We had it in our family for many, many years. And Cary and I were talking before the podcast as to whether it works. And the answer to that is it could work if I wanted it to work. Why would I not want it to work? Because right now, if it were working, we would be hearing loud bonging every 15 minutes of the podcast, which would not be good.
Oh, good. So you definitely did a good job while I was moving the slides on the screen. Can you see the screen
I
slides?
can.
Okay,
I
perfect.
can.
So just another quick reminder, the clock is ticking and I really want to have the best and the brightest attend this course because I want you to be successful in your diversity and inclusion initiatives. And we've already got 8 people. We want 10 leaders. We have 8. We have 2 positions. We have 2 spaces left. So don't delay. It starts June 10th. Contact me. All right. So, Rick, I'm going to take myself off the screen and it's going to be you and your slides. So, can you tell us a little bit about these statements?
Well, again, sort of similar to what I was saying before, that it's not simply a nice to have that we're doing nice things as corporate America. But as of today, I think the last statistic I read, 86% of companies have some sort of Fortune 500 companies have some sort of social responsibility statement as part of their annual report. And that was, I think, data taken in 2018. And you can imagine on the heels of 2020 that number is probably at this point well over 90%. So there's an expectation. It's no longer, again, a nice to have, that all companies are realigning their corporate social responsibility efforts and messaging to what matters now to individual constituencies. Now, that individual constituencies piece is really important because, and I'll talk about this more as we move on, we're no longer focused strictly on shareholder value, but now we're focused on stakeholder value. And I'm going to explain what that is in just a second. But this is a study that was done in 2018, November, so it's less than 2 years old. And some data points, and I know that this is probably an eye chart for some people, but the more brands, 66% think that brands should take a public stand on important social issues. So that's 2/3 of the public who responded to this study feel that it's important for brands to take some position. They'd also, 61%, 6 out of 10, would recommend a brand to their friends that aligns with their social values. 52% would spend more money with a brand that aligns with their social values. And 51% believe that a brand taking a public stand on something with which they disagree would not stop them from shopping with that brand. Now, that last number is one to think about, because 51% say that a brand or a company taking a position that a consumer disagrees with would not stop them. But that means that almost half, 49%, would perhaps be inclined to shop less if they felt that the company's values were not aligned to their own. So that's sort of a half empty, half full statistic. But what we see is that we see a bit of a repudiation to the old thinking that was dominant for many years, that brands and companies are not supposed to be in business for the purpose of bringing social change. They're simply in the business of driving money for their shareholders or stakeholders, or the people that ultimately profit from the business. And that's really where the big change has come, reflected in these statistics and numbers.
I think it's so interesting because my work in marketing to women, this has been in different studies that we would use and still use to support why companies and brands should be socially responsible. These statistics, I would say, if it were just women being interviewed 10 years
Mhm.
ago, this would be in alignment. It's
Mhm.
probably higher if you just, I'm not saying women have only been the ones interested in this, but it's been consistent over a long time. So that's I think something I just want to throw in there.
Well, and I think it's also interesting that this is from a consumer perspective. So
Yeah,
this is how
yeah,
consumers feel, and yet people who are in the boardroom, such as the people with whom you work, recognize that if you don't do these things, you're going to get dinged for it in the consumer's eyes.
there's
And
that for sure. Yeah.
there's that. So, we can talk a little bit about several categories of social responsibility. And I think they fall into some buckets. And one bucket is the things that you have to do. And these won't necessarily drive greater value if you do them, but they will lose you value if you don't do them. So, for example, don't dump toxic waste. If you're a healthcare insurer company, don't prohibit people who don't have money from getting adequate healthcare. Those are things that are pretty much requirements, table stakes, if you're in that particular business. The should do's take it a step above that. They take it beyond what's necessary, but still don't represent a great stretch. And then there's something that I think is really interesting to talk about, and that are the can do's, the things that we can do. We may want to, we may not want to do that. And that's something we can chat about in just a bit.
Okay. How about the next slide then? Is this
Okay.
helpful?
Yeah. So this is when we talk about stakeholders in the term of stakeholder capitalism. When we used to talk about shareholders, we were talking specifically about the people who stood to profit as a result of company performance. But now our view of who the stakeholders are is much broader. Obviously, we still have customers to be concerned about. We have employees, consumers, which is the consuming public as a whole, not necessarily the customers who are doing business with a particular organization, suppliers, nonprofit partners, and let me focus on two really important ones: investors and regulators. Investors become very important because there's a lot of belief right now that in the future, your positions on corporate social responsibility, the things that you represent, the actions you take, how you fall on stakeholder capital concerns is going to affect your ability to get access to working capital. And that becomes, again, a huge issue for stockholders, investors. The regulators are also stepping in there. I was talking recently to a friend of mine who works in healthcare insurance, and one of the things that they were trying to tackle as a healthcare insurer is this whole issue of surprise billing. So, you get taken to an emergency room, and lo and behold, your doctor is in network, but the anesthesiologist who put you under isn't. And so now you've got a big bill. So they were trying to internally tackle this issue, but the government just stepped in December and passed a surprise billing act. And so if you don't follow your own solution, if you don't identify your own fix to the problem and get involved in a collaborative method with your other stakeholders, someone is very likely to do it for you.
Yeah. Companies don't like that. And but consumers are more powerful as well as employees, more powerful than ever. And now and please, comment on this,
Mhm.
is that an employee and an investor are not as far apart as they used to be. As a matter of fact, employees have a lot more power.
Well, let me talk about why that is. Remember when I was talking at the onset of this podcast, and I was talking about the people that own the factories and the people who worked in those factories? Well, as I mentioned, in those days, if you get hurt in the job or you get displaced, we can find somebody else to come in and be that cog in the machine. We have since that time moved on to an experience-based economy, or a service-based economy where people represent the capital. So it's no longer owning the machines, it's what I bring to the workforce and what's between my ears that
Hmm.
represents value for the company. When I was at Gallup, we used to quote a statistic. I don't know where it came from, but anytime I've ever quoted it, nobody's argued with it. I think there could be some variance here, but they used to like to quote the statistic that uh, whenever you replace an employee, it costs the company that person's first year salary to replace that person. And so when you look at high turnover sectors like retail and the hospitality industry is certainly one. If you can reduce voluntary turnover, it's huge for the bottom line.
Yes.
Attracting good talent. We know that there's a lot of people out there looking for a job, but being able to attract talent to your company and have that be the best talent to give you that competitive edge. You want to attract the best people. Well, you're going to have to reflect the values of a company for which they'd like to work. And we know that customers and employees want to shop companies or be affiliated with companies that share their values. When I did a ton of marketing research, one question that we'd ask is, this is a company for someone like me, or this is a company for someone like me to work with. It was interesting back in the days when I did these employee engagement studies, we found out that less than 10% could strongly agree that their company's values were completely consistent with their own. And
Oh.
yet when we did find situations where there was values alignment between employees and employers, we found engagement levels and the likelihood to remain employed and the likelihood to recommend as an employer for employment branding purposes, all those sorts of things, the likeliness and willingness to recommend my company's products and services to other people, that all those things directly impact the bottom line. It's a little fuzzier for some people, but it's certainly something that we can calculate and determine that all those things, again, become a necessary imperative for a successful business performance. And that's why boards and board members and stakeholders and stockholders and whoever, are very, very interested in these issues.
Yeah.
Diversity and inclusion, again, because, we want a workforce and we want customers that look like America, we have to have diversity and inclusion. I was sharing with you before we got on a couple companies I worked with at least a decade ago, if not more. But Darden Restaurants was one good example. They had a Black CEO at the time, and they focused in on the African American Italian restaurant, casual Italian restaurant category. So Olive Garden is their offering, and people may not know this, but at the time, and haven't seen recently what the numbers look like, but at the time, Olive Garden easily owned the Black Italian casual dining segment.
Wow.
And Choice Hotels was another company that I worked with. They had strong diversity and inclusion efforts to attract minority owners, franchise owners, franchise-based models. And that was one segment that was being completely ignored, was the minority owner who might invest in hotel development. And so, again, it was a very successful strategy for the company at the time. And again,
So successful, so
yeah,
smart. And
yeah, and it's good business,
it's also what I love about that. Of course, it reminds me of my time at Wyndham when we focused on the women's market, and by listening and responding to women, we were able to own that market for about 5 years. Nobody else
Mhm.
thought women were going to be as um, I guess, lucrative customers as
Yeah.
they've turned out to be. So what I love about what you do when you talk about these subjects, Rick, is you bring up specific examples backed up by research. And our research with women were that we found out that women were willing to pay $14 more per night
Mhm.
for a safer, cleaner, better experience. And we
Mhm.
asked them for their suggestions and their input. And I think that's where you have always been a stellar example of someone who, you don't just have a blanket idea that you think is a good idea. You back it up with
Mhm.
research, and it's really important to start with research on any of this.
Very much so. And in fact, I remember one time when I was interviewing for my first position at the Gallup Organization, they asked me in the interview the question, and maybe I'll be a little controversial here when I say this.
Okay, do it.
Do you believe that people who make decisions without the basis supporting data, do you believe that those people are stupid? Now, calling people stupid is a very impolite term, but I
Where
had
was
to
this question? Where was it posed?
In the Gallup screening
Oh,
interview
wow.
process. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
And again, it's a long story and I won't belabor it, but I kind of felt like, yeah, I didn't like to use the word stupid because I just
Right.
think it's a rude term.
Yeah.
But I think that people who
I don't
make
like it when people
decisions,
call me stupid.
well, nobody does. But I was going to say, I certainly agree with the principle that people who make statements without supporting data are taking great risks with themselves and their businesses, because
Yeah.
I've seen many people who say, well, I've been around, I've been working in this field for 30 years and I don't need any study to tell me what I already know. And, you can see that those people generally run their ship into the beach. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so
And
I'm a big
time,
believer.
I think you walk the talk. Okay,
Mhm.
I'll keep going.
Okay,
So we
please.
have other things. Should I click through?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this, but let me share what this blue slide is.
Okay.
I clipped this from the cover of a report put out by the World Economic Forum, where they actually came out with stakeholder capitalism metrics. 120 businesses got together, sat down, and collaborated on identifying 21 primary metrics that they use to basically evaluate whether a company is performing well on all these stakeholder capital issues. And they fall into four categories. One is governance, essentially starting off, do you have a purpose for why your company exists? And is it stated that people understand and are familiar? And then governance is all sorts of things about how ethically is your company ran, how much accountability is there, those sorts of things. The second is planet, and it's all around sustainability issues, carbon footprint, greenhouse gases, water usage, land usage, all of those sorts of things. The third pillar is people. And it's all these sorts of things like diversity, inclusion, the percentage of people of different genders and different races who are incorporated, all of the OSHA safety incidents, all these things that have to do with how people are being treated, which again impact the bottom line. And then finally, the last one is profitability or prosperity, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, like, is there this great disparity between the CEO or some people in the money and the company making money and the people who work for that company, having a relatively low standard of living. And
Right.
all about the things we talked about, but these are going to be the metrics moving forward. And there are people who strongly believe, and I'm one of them, that this is going to become the new normal, rather than looking simply at shareholder capitalism, looking at these stakeholder metrics, 21 right out there for people to read in this report, and why all of the things we're talking about are so critical to business.
And where can people find this report?
I think if you go on the WEF, World Economic Forum, that you
Okay.
can find that report there. It's downloadable. I downloaded the whole report and read through it. So it's
Great.
interesting. It's interesting reading.
Perfect. So people, planet, and prosperity
And
is
governance is the first
in
one.
governance. Okay. So, I picked this example. You and I wanted to pick some examples, and actually, we've talked about this, but tell people listening about what CVS Health is doing right now.
Sure. We wanted to pick some examples of people who are doing things really well. And this one popped out to us for a couple of reasons, and let me talk about what those reasons are. The first of the metrics put out by the WEF is essentially, do you have a purpose? And what is that purpose? Right here, right on the website, CVS immediately states its purpose right up front. So if they were being measured on these stakeholder capital metrics, they get a nice checkbox for that one. It's helping people on their path to better health. Now, again, why is this important? One of the things that I've seen, and I refer back to something I said earlier, one of the things that I've seen where companies could use some help and assistance is so many social responsibility efforts are pretty scattershot. In other words, they're all over the map. They're talking about, social justice over here. They're talking about helping wildfire victims over here. They're talking about supporting veterans. They're all over the map. And they don't really seem to have a common unified theme. One of the key pieces of advice I share with companies is how important it is to be able to map your social responsibility initiatives and sustainability initiatives back to your central core purpose. If you don't know what that is, you don't have it stated, then your CSR efforts tend to be a little bit less focused and meaningful. And so
Rick,
what I like about this is it's very clear.
It's very clear. And before I forget, I want to make sure if people want to contact you and talk to you further about any of this, what's the best way to reach you? Is it LinkedIn or otherwise?
LinkedIn is always good. That's always good. I will tell you my email where I can be contacted directly is rgarlick, Garlick. Make sure you put the K on the end of the name. A lot of people like to spell it like the spice at Magid, Magid.com.
Perfect.
And, we have a lot of thinking that we won't be able to get into now. Maybe in part two, we'll get to it. But this is a good example of someone who's doing it right.
What about this?
Well, see, here's, again, what I like about this is that we assume that any reference to CSR or sustainability or any of these kind of things we talked about is all aligned with what we might consider more progressive causes.
And if you're not watching this visually on the recording, this is a Chick-fil-A slide.
So Chick-fil-A is a company that has also really taken a stance on issues. Some people don't like the stances they take because they tend to be very politically conservative. But this particular slide says why we're closed on Sundays. For them, valuing families and allowing employees to spend time with their families and the whole focus on traditional families and extended families and all the rest is a big part of the pillar of who Chick-fil-A is about. Now, again, Chick-fil-A got a lot of backlash when it took a stand on what we would call maintaining the traditional family. A lot of backlash of people that didn't want to go there. And yet what was interesting on the day of a planned protest, they had, from what I understand, their highest sales day in their history.
Wow.
And if you go to a Chick-fil-A, you'll see my son goes to Penn State, and in the student union, the line for Chick-fil-A is out the door, where everybody else, you can walk right up to the counter for the other fast food options.
It's really amazing. What about this? What about I'm in line always for Ben and Jerry ice cream. What about them?
See, this is another great example because it's all about whatever you take. And this particular slide says we use our position to influence change. And they believe that business has the opportunity to be a powerful lever of change in the world. They would represent the other political end of the spectrum, and they're doing very successfully. The moral of the story is you have to know your customer. This gets back to what we were talking about, the can-do strategies. Ben and Jerry's takes a lot of progressive stance, and it appeals to their particular customer base. It appeals to their employee base. Chick-fil-A, on the opposite end of the spectrum, does the same sorts of things, but from what we would call more of a right-wing or conservative position than Ben and Jerry's. Both are successful companies. You don't have to do one thing or the other from a business perspective, but you have to do it consistently, and you have to link that back to your overall strategy and what you believe your particular customer wants to see, and your employee base, what they want to see.
I think it's
And
interesting that Ben and Jerry's was purchased by Unilever.
mhm,
And another example, Whole Foods was purchased by Amazon.
mhm.
And I do believe, I mean, my perspective is that neither Unilever or Amazon are really dictating what these companies are doing from a corporate social responsibility perspective, that they've kind of left them alone because they understand that this is so important to the planet, people and profits, and the government. So I think it's interesting.
And I don't question that the people who head up these large corporations, have certain political views or beliefs or social beliefs or are I believe that they're concerned about the climate, all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, Cary, businesses exist to make money. They exist to drive profit. And if companies were taking positions that were costing them customers and employees and investors, they probably would not be as bold in taking those positions. I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement to know that, money is the blood that makes a company uh, profitable, function, and the opportunities that you have pointed out, that employees in particular are so, I don't know, their voices are, and their perspective and their belief systems are very much a part of making the blood run through the company. And I keep going back to that because people are having hard times right now hiring uh, employees. And so it's just, to me, a very interesting paradigm shift.
Well, I think what's been interesting about it, and again, this is not to get political on any side, but I think it's interesting. I talked about how unions, labor unions, were initially responsible for closing the equality gap. And I think it's interesting that this whole thing where people are saying, well, we're paying people to stay home. And, the result has been that a lot of these places have been raising their wages to attract employees.
Hmm.
Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. And again,
Yeah.
I'm just saying that as an individual expressing an opinion, but my son worked at Walmart. Uh, and, basically he told me that the local Walmart made in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, not a large town or city, made $100,000 a day. Does it hurt them to raise their employee wages in order to attract talent? Maybe they could share a little bit of that profitability with their employee base. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think the more that happens, the less you'll hear a lot of cries for things that people aren't wanting to see happen in
Yeah,
government.
I think that's a great example. And speaking of examples, I picked this with your blessing,
Mhm.
this example of how a company like Fiserve, this is actually from a Fiserve corporate social responsibility brochure that I was able to download. And I liked the way they bring if you can't see this, and you're listening to this from your device, they frame this as cultural framework in a company. And so they're speaking about their culture. And Rick, I want you to comment on this, if you will, but they're speaking about their culture and how it helps them achieve their business goals.
Mhm. And a lot of that, you think about customers reading this, it's certainly likely to impress customers, but you and I have talked about how things impact employees. I often talk about an example of many years ago when the Sara Lee Corporation, that, basically that makes your pastries and pies, they were also a sister company to the Hanes brand that made your t-shirts
Yes.
and
Yeah,
underwear and socks.
I remember
And
this.
a lot of people didn't really put those two together, but they were part of the same company. And
Mhm.
now they spun off, and that's no longer the case. But when people walked through the door at Sara Lee, they looked up and they saw a sign that said, "We feed and clothe the world." Now
Nice.
think about how much more inspirational that is than we sell pastries and underwear.
Right.
And whenever you see a company like Fiserve putting something like this in front of people to move money and information in a way that moves the world, talking about purpose, talking about mission, it not only frames the company in a positive way for customers, but also if you're working for that company, an area that I'm about to look into and study is this whole notion of having pride in the workplace. And, if in terms of engendering pride, what that means for employee engagement, productivity, retention, all those sorts of things. Again, underscoring, these are all things that impact a company's bottom line.
Absolutely. And as they show, they're on the Fortune, excuse me, Fortune 500 or Fortune World's Most Admired Companies. So that gives a good example, I think, there. Rick, we're getting close to our time limit. Are there some other slides you want me to show?
Yeah, I just, if you wouldn't mind, the last slide would be great.
Okay,
If you
let's
wouldn't
show
mind.
that. Let me go back to that. And this is so fascinating because I could talk about this all day. So this is
This is what our company like to call the slide you just showed. We like to
okay.
call that the spaghetti slide.
Okay.
And and it's just simply a graphic representation of all the various activities, messages, constituencies, and the value to each of those stakeholders. This looks like a very complex process, but the next slide shows how our company focuses on and solves this problem. I think some people might be looking at this, listening to this podcast and thinking, well, this is great, but how do I take this on? Here's the process we use. And certainly we'd love to be available to anybody listening or who would listen to share this further. But the first thing is identify who the key stakeholders of interest are. In other words, we showed you a lot of potential stakeholders. Some of those might be more or less important to you if you're privately held and you're not looking to attract investors and your industry is not really under scrutiny for regulation. Maybe they're less important, but certainly employees and customers are core. So first of all, identifying those key stakeholders. And then the second piece is identifying those priorities, understanding that your employees and your customers might have very different priorities. And you and I, Cary, we talked a lot about professional sports, how, the whole Colin Kaepernick thing of a couple of years ago, how the fans, the customers, didn't really like, in many cases, players kneeling in the national anthem. But that was an issue that was very important to many of the players. And so the NFL made a decision that at this point, their stakeholders, their players, were a higher priority than perhaps some of the fan base, thinking that it would be more valuable to their organization to have player alignment and player unity and solidarity than it was to
Sure.
even potentially, and understanding that priorities might clash and that's okay, but it leaves us this puzzle to solve. So once we're able to identify the priorities, reconcile which ones we want to tackle, the next is creating and validating messaging. And one of the things, I was talking with the chairman of our company, Brent Magid, about a healthcare company that we work with, and they've done all sorts of great work in the area of corporate social responsibility. And the chairman of my company, who is a customer, says, I'm a customer and I didn't know they were doing these things. Now, if you're not communicating what you're doing, you're probably leaving a lot of money on the table because you're not getting the impact. And again, it leaves, if you don't pronounce the efforts you're making, then it leaves it to a web crawling app to identify those for somebody. But a lot of money is being left on the table. Also looking at the most effective channels. How do you get that message out to your customers, your employees, your stakeholders? Monetizing the value. In some cases, there are certain things you have to do that won't bring you extra ROI, but certainly if you don't do those things, they potentially cost you things. But it's a calculated decision with a lot of moving parts that you have to think about and then finally prioritize the action. So that's just a simple graphic of how to think about this and how to take it on. So I leave you with that. And I just love this discussion. And obviously we need to do a part two.
Oh yeah, we absolutely want you back to explore this further. We want to do part two with Dr. Rick Garlick, and corporate social responsibility. And again, I think you covered how we can measure the value of the investments in CSR and ESG. I love throwing out these acronyms. And we want people to, not everybody understands, not everybody wants to use the acronyms, and I get it. And we don't want to prevent people from knowing what these are. So this is what is great about this podcast, Rick. You've explained corporate social responsibility and the processes we need to look at, as well as ESG, and again, environmental, social, and governance, and lots of
Mhm.
other things that play into this, all the stakeholder value.